He demanded a salute from her in front of the entire nation. The crowd held its breath. Cameras captured her every move. But what she did made everyone freeze and change that day forever. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun over Washington, D.C. hung high and bright, spreading an unrelenting but gentle warmth across the National Mall. It was the kind of day that seemed purposefully crafted for remembrance. Clear skies without a single wandering cloud, a steady breeze that caused the flags lined along the pathways to sway with quiet dignity, and a light that gave everything it touched. Polished stone, manicured grass, crisp uniforms, a sharp, almost reverential clarity. From early morning, crowds had gathered in growing waves, filling the space between the Lincoln Memorial and the towering obelisk of the Washington Monument. Families arrived hand in hand, many clutching miniature American flags distributed by volunteers. Veterans in their late years were pushed gently in wheelchairs by sons or daughters, some draped in worn jackets from a war long past. Young cadets in spotless uniforms stood in disciplined clusters, whispering among themselves as they straightened caps or adjusted the brass buttons on their jackets. The air carried the hum of anticipation mingled with the faint, solemn sound of a military band rehearsing in the distance. Cameras and media crews formed tight rows near the stage, set at the heart of the event. Large screens flanked the platform, projecting images of the crowd and amplifying each small movement or gesture. At the center of it all stood a polished podium draped in red, white, and blue, framed by towering arrangements of flowers. White lilies, red roses, blue hydrangeas, arranged to mirror the flag's colors. It was ceremonial grandeur on full display, meant for an audience of millions watching across the nation. But there was an undeniable weight in the air that went beyond pageantry. This was Memorial Day, a day for quiet reflection as much as public spectacle. Every detail reflected that duality. Soldiers stationed in ceremonial positions, with rifles held in pristine stillness, news anchors murmuring rehearsed lines into microphones, parents pointing toward the reflective surface of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and softly explaining its meaning to children too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel its gravity. Ronda Rousey stepped onto the plaza with the unhurried composure of someone accustomed to attention, yet uninterested in claiming it. She had arrived without any entourage, no handlers trailing behind her or press cameras flashing specifically for her. She wore a dark navy suit precise in its tailoring, modest but commanding, paired with simple black heels that clicked softly against the stone path. Her hair was pulled back into a clean knot at the nape of her neck, exposing a face that seemed carved from discipline itself. There was no overt display in her demeanor, no waves to the cameras, no polite smiles for reporters. Her presence spoke louder in silence than in any announcement. Those nearby recognized her instantly, murmurs rising like gentle ripples through the rows of onlookers. Children tugged at parents' sleeves and pointed. Older veterans, many leaning on canes, squinted for a clearer look and nodded faintly to themselves, as if in approval. She passed through the crowd quietly, moving toward her reserved seat near the front row. The pathway cleared naturally for her, not by command but by instinct, as though those around her sensed her steady authority without needing it explained. A few journalists swung their cameras her way, capturing tight, framed shots of her measured stride. The live broadcast feed picked up her image for a moment, flashing her face on the massive screens looming over the gathering. Her calm expression magnified so even those at the farthest edges could see her with perfect clarity. Ronda sat near a row of decorated veterans, their jackets weighted by gleaming rows of medals. One man, stooped with age, leaned slightly toward her and offered a polite nod. She returned it without words, her face betraying only a faint acknowledgement. Her hands folded neatly in her lap as she surveyed the space. The stage with its solemn backdrop, the fluttering banners, the line of high-ranking officials preparing behind the curtains. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the Vietnam Memorial Wall stretching dark and endless in polished granite, its thousands of engraved names catching stray beams of sunlight like fragments of memory refusing to fade. It was there, she knew, that the heart of the day lay, not in speeches or applause, but in those etched letters that drew countless visitors year after year. The murmur of the crowd rose and fell in waves, families settling into their places, reporters whispering directives to cameramen, children shifting impatiently before being hushed. Here and there, the scent of sun-warmed grass mingled with the faint tang of metal from flagpoles clanging gently in the breeze. Distantly, the rhythmic thump of ceremonial drums carried from behind the stage, setting a cadence that echoed faintly across the plaza and lent an air of formal anticipation. The ceremony had not yet begun, but there was already a gravity in the air that drew everyone inward. Even the laughter of children dimmed to quiet questions as they looked around at the faces of veterans seated in the front rows, at the older women clutching folded flags in their laps, at the stern lines of uniformed officers stationed near the stage. The moment was layered, celebration on its surface, but beneath it a deep and steady river of remembrance. Rhonda shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze steady and unreadable. Cameras drifted past her again, operators mindful to capture glimpses of notable guests among the crowd. A producer's voice buzzed from an earpiece nearby, instructing his team to keep a wide pan over the sea of flags, then hold focus on the stage. She was used to it, the way her image would be woven silently into the coverage as part of a larger narrative of American grit and strength. It did not bother her, nor did it flatter her. It was simply another part of the stage set around her, one she neither resisted nor sought to dominate. The air shifted slightly as the military band's warm-up concluded, and a brief hush settled across the plaza, broken only by the soft rustle of flags and the distant whir of drone-mounted cameras adjusting their positions high overhead. Organizers in suits and earpieces hurriedly checked notes, signaled one another with curt nods, and moved toward their designated positions along the perimeter. Several rows behind Rhonda, a small boy sitting on his father's shoulders pointed toward the massive screens now displaying the official emblem of the ceremony and asked something in a whisper. His father responded quietly, his voice low and reverent. The boy nodded solemnly and tightened his grip on the small flag he held. Slowly, the crowd's restless energy condensed into focused anticipation. All eyes turned toward the stage, waiting for the first signs of movement. A low hum of microphones being tested crackled faintly through speakers. Above the plaza, birds circled in wide arcs before disappearing beyond the tree line, as though even nature itself understood it was time to yield space to stillness. Rhonda exhaled through her nose, steady and calm, her gaze forward and unwavering. This was why she had come. Not for spectacle, not for cameras, but for that singular quietness that descends on such days, a silence shared by thousands, heavy enough to press on the chest, yet strangely unifying in its weight. When the announcer's voice finally rang out, strong and resonant, it signaled the shift from waiting to witnessing. The ceremony was beginning. Rhonda's posture remained fixed, her focus sharpened. Behind her, the vast crowd leaned in subtly, drawn by the gravity of the moment. The first notes of a formal introduction echoed over the loudspeakers, inviting dignitaries and officials toward the platform. Somewhere in that ordered procession, a name would soon draw attention louder than any other. And with it, a storm neither she nor the crowd yet foresaw would break the solemn air they now breathed together. And yet for that fleeting moment before words claimed the space, all remained untouched. A plaza blanketed in silence and sun, a sea of faces turned toward the same point, flags trembling lightly against the breeze, and Ronda Rousey sitting motionless among them, unaware that before this day ended, every camera in the nation would swing entirely toward her. The announcer's voice faded into the stillness, replaced by a brief murmur of anticipation that rippled through the crowd like wind across tall grass. A hush soon followed, absolute and expectant, as Donald Trump emerged from the wings of the stage. He walked with a familiar gait, slow but deliberate, his shoulders squared beneath a crisp, dark suit, his red tie hanging in its usual defiant length. The sun caught on his cufflinks as he lifted a hand to wave, and the massive screens flanking the stage magnified the gesture to such proportions that even those standing at the very edge of the plaza could see it. The applause began in hesitant bursts, spreading unevenly before congealing into a rolling wave of noise that rose from pockets of the crowd and broke against the silence of those who withheld it. He stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease, letting the clapping trail off naturally until the plaza grew still enough to hear the faint rustle of flags in the wind. His expression was one of controlled satisfaction, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before settling into the familiar rhythm of command. The first words of his speech rang out strong, carrying across the expanse of stone and grass, polished by years of repetition. He spoke of the nation's strength, of sacrifice and honor, weaving through anecdotes about military valor and American greatness that elicited polite applause in predictable intervals. At first, it was nothing unusual. His tone was ceremonial, the cadence of his voice measured to fit the occasion, his words tethered to the script of tradition. He praised the veterans seated near the front rows, gesturing toward them in sweeping motions. The crowd clapped dutifully. Cameras panned across their faces, stoic, weathered, and unmoved as if carved from the same stone as the memorial behind them. On the screens, their quiet dignity became magnified symbols of the day's purpose. Yet as the speech continued, something shifted. His delivery, once anchored in broad platitudes, began to take on a sharper edge, infused with the theatrical energy that had defined so much of his public life. He glanced briefly to his right, and then his eyes fell upon her. Ronda sat precisely where she had been since her arrival, unmoved, her posture impeccable. The expression on her face was unchanged, neutral, calm, and unreadable. For a moment his gaze lingered. Then his lips curved faintly, and his tone altered almost imperceptibly, just enough for the change to ripple outward through those who noticed. He spoke her name. The sound of it carried cleanly through the amplifiers, landing on the plaza like a pebble dropped into still water. People shifted in their seats, heads turned toward her. Even those who had not recognized her until then suddenly did, murmuring softly as her image appeared on the massive screens. She remained utterly still. Trump gestured toward her in a manner that seemed casual, even playful at first. But there was a weight beneath it, a performative flourish that betrayed a desire to turn her presence into part of his spectacle. He spoke of her career with a veneer of admiration, but his words were tinged with patronage. He framed her victories as curiosities, accomplishments that seemed to amuse more than impress him, threading in quips about strength and femininity that drew thin laughter from scattered corners of the crowd. It was the kind of laughter that came not from humor, but from discomfort disguised as compliance, brittle and short-lived. On the screens, Rhonda's image remained fixed. She sat motionless, her chin level, her gaze directed forward and slightly upward toward the stage, though her expression gave away nothing of what she thought or felt. The cameras lingered on her longer than they should have, as if compelled by the tension building invisibly around her. The air seemed to tighten. Even the distant hum of traffic beyond the mall felt as though it had dimmed, replaced by the collective silence of thousands listening to words that no longer aligned with the gravity of the day. A few veterans shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes flicking between the stage and the woman who had suddenly become its unintended focal point. One of them, a man in his 70s wearing a jacket adorned with faded service patches, sat rigid, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead. Beside him, a woman in a pale summer dress held the hand of a boy who could not have been older than 10, her thumb stroking his knuckles absently, while her own gaze hardened on the figure at the podium. Trump leaned slightly forward, placing both hands on the podium as he continued. His words took on the practiced rhythm of a showman, playing to his audience, rather than the solemnity of a statesman addressing a memorial. He spoke of respect, of hierarchy, of the kind of deference owed to leaders, threading his narrative in such a way that it curved ever closer to her without naming her again outright. The tension was no longer subtle. It had teeth now, sharp and deliberate, biting into the quiet reverence of the ceremony. In the press section, cameras pivoted sharply, some focusing back on the stage, others swinging toward Ronda. Wide shots captured both in a single frame. The speaker at the podium, animated and commanding, and the silent woman below, composed and unflinching, her stillness growing more pronounced with every passing second. The image told its own story, one the words above her head could not control. The plaza felt different now. Applause came haltingly, not with the rhythm of shared enthusiasm, but with the awkward staccato of scattered hands meeting out of obligation rather than conviction. Children, sensing the shift, though they could not name it, went quiet. The rustling of flags overhead became more distinct, as if the wind itself was leaning in to listen. Trump's voice rose slightly, pressing against that silence, filling the space with a demand that seemed less about honor and more about control. He gestured more broadly now, his movements sharp enough to cut through the measured formality expected of such occasions. It was subtle still, wrapped in the language of ceremony, but those watching closely could see it. This was no longer a speech only about remembrance. It had become something else entirely, a performance, a provocation, an assertion wrapped in a smile. Through it all, Ronda did not move. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady. She neither flinched nor reacted, but the camera stayed on her, drawn as if by magnetism to the stark contrast between her silence and his volume. In that dissonance, the seeds of something larger were already being sown, though no one yet knew how swiftly they would bloom. By the time he paused for breath, the plaza was suspended in a strange limbo. The official ceremony had been overtaken by a current that none of the organizers had anticipated. Ronda's name hung in the air like an unanswered question, and all eyes, whether in the plaza or watching from living rooms across the country, shifted between the podium and the woman who had not spoken a word, but whose presence had already begun to reshape the room. The tension lingered like static in the summer heat. It was palpable, invisible, but undeniable, stretching thinner and thinner, waiting only for the moment when it would be pulled taut enough to break. The air had grown heavy in the aftermath of his pointed remarks, an invisible weight pressing down upon the crowd. Even those who had come for nothing more than to watch quietly and leave found themselves leaning forward now, caught in the slow coiling of tension. It was as though every sound had dulled except his voice, and even that voice, amplified by the powerful speakers, seemed almost too sharp against the quiet backdrop of a memorial meant for solemn reverence. The military band that had played its measured notes minutes before stood frozen in silence at the edge of the platform, their instruments gleaming in the sun but unused, as though even they had been muted by the shifting gravity of the moment. Trump straightened his tie with a brisk motion, squared his shoulders, and stepped closer to the podium. His hand rested on its edge, fingers splayed, gripping it with subtle authority as he surveyed the rows of faces beneath him. Then he smiled, a broad, showy grin that felt misplaced against the hallowed setting, and raised his chin slightly, the gesture one of deliberate control. He raised a hand and gestured toward Ronda again, unmistakably now, as if singling her out for the cameras that eagerly followed every shift in his posture. The words that came next carried a clear edge. They were wrapped in ceremonial phrasing, but their meaning was impossible to miss. He spoke of discipline, of respect, of what it meant to honor the office and its occupant. His voice boomed across the plaza, filling every crevice of silence with a command thinly veiled as rhetoric. He spoke of saluting leaders, of symbols of unity and obedience, directing each phrase as though casting a spotlight on her without needing to say her name again. Eyes turned to her. It was no longer a matter of curiosity now, but fixation. On the giant screens towering over the plaza, her face appeared again, serene and immovable, framed by the bright sun above and the crowd surrounding her. She didn't flinch, didn't shift in her seat, her expression the same as it had been from the moment she arrived, calm, unreadable, and steadfast. The longer she sat in silence, the more her stillness seemed to gather its own quiet force. The crowd, restless moments before, now seemed unsure how to respond. Whispers flitted through the rows, hushed and fleeting, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something sliding into unfamiliar territory. Trump extended his arm forward in an unmistakable gesture, his palm up, fingers curling slightly inward as if beckoning for compliance. He demanded acknowledgement, respect framed as ritual, embodied in a salute that would seal the moment as his. The words struck with the unmistakable tone of someone not requesting but ordering, the cadence of a man used to commanding a room. He pointed toward her with a sweeping motion, the cameras obediently following his lead to capture both him and her in the same frame. It was an image calculated to dominate, authority towering above composure, power pressing down upon silence. But Ronda did not move. The plaza held its breath. From the rows of seated guests near the front to the sprawling mass of people standing farther back along the reflecting pool, a hush spread so deep it was almost physical. The sound of a lone flagpole rope clinking faintly against its metal mast could be heard clearly now, sharp and distinct in the absence of applause or murmured conversation. Even the restless shifting of feet slowed, as if no one dared disturb the quiet that had enveloped them. She rose. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. One moment she was seated in her place among the front rows, and the next she stood with measured poise, her figure straight and tall against the brightness of the day. All eyes followed her ascent, as though pulled by invisible strings. The cameras shifted instantly, lenses narrowing in on her face, capturing every detail of her steady gaze, the set of her jaw, the precise calm in her expression. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the stone pathway, as she moved past the seated veterans and officials through the narrow aisle that parted instinctively before her. Her approach was soundless but commanding. The distance between her and the stage closed slowly, each step stretching out in time as the anticipation thickened around her. No one spoke. No one dared. A line of cadets near the side straightened unconsciously, their postures reflexively mirroring hers. Behind her, the murmuring whispers had stilled entirely, replaced by the eerie sound of nothing but her footsteps, steady and unbroken, carrying her toward the front of the plaza. Trump's gaze tracked her progress, his expression unreadable but tinged faintly with surprise at her unflinching composure. He stood taller, adjusted his stance, and looked down from the podium with an air of expectancy, as though waiting for her to perform the gesture he had demanded, a salute that would bend the moment to his will, televised for all to see. The cameras drank it in greedily, knowing instinctively that this was no longer simply a speech, but a confrontation broadcast live. Ronda came to a stop directly before the stage, not at its base but far enough forward that the breadth of the plaza opened behind her like a sea of silent witnesses. She did not look up at him right away. Her head turned slightly toward the memorial wall in the distance, its black granite surface gleaming in the sun, engraved with the thousands of names of the fallen. Only after that did her gaze rise calm and steady to meet his. The silence between them was absolute. It was not the silence of absence, but of attention, an all-consuming stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums, heightening every detail, the faint rattle of camera tripods, the distant caw of a bird overhead, the shallow breaths drawn by those in the audience who dared not exhale too loudly. Trump shifted at the podium, his voice filling the air again, louder now, each syllable clipped and sharp as he reiterated his demand. His gestures became broader, his words more pointed, his tone that of a man determined to reclaim the control that seemed to slip the longer she remained unmoved. He spoke of respect once more, of order, of tradition, all of it wrapped in the language of patriotism, but delivered with the unmistakable undercurrent of command. Yet she stood as still as stone. Her shoulders were squared, her arms resting easily at her sides, her expression unchanged. Every camera locked onto her face, capturing her immovable presence against the background of the stage. In that frame, the contrast between them was stark. Him, elevated and booming from behind a podium, arms slicing through the air. Her, grounded and wordless, silent and rooted to the spot. The veterans in the front row exchanged glances, but remained motionless, their lined faces betraying a mix of recognition and unease. They had seen moments like this before. Not here, not like this, but in times when defiance and discipline shared the same stillness. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering a question that went unanswered as her gaze remained fixed forward, transfixed by the tableau unfolding before her. The demand hung in the air between them, unanswered and heavy, stretched taut across the plaza like a cable pulled to the brink of snapping. Ronda's silence spoke louder than any rebuttal could have. Her refusal to move was not hesitation, nor was it rebellion for its own sake. It was something quieter, deeper, like the steady gravity of a mountain unmoved by wind or storm. And in that moment, before anything else could break it, the entire crowd felt it too. A shift, subtle yet profound. The first faint recognition that whatever was happening here had outgrown speeches and ceremony. It was no longer a matter of politics or showmanship. It had become a test of something far greater, and every soul present could sense it gathering around her like a tide about to surge. The plaza had fallen into a silence so complete it seemed unnatural for a space that moments before had echoed with speeches, murmurs, and restless, shifting feet. Now not a sound remained but the faint whisper of the breeze threading through the flags that lined the National Mall. Even the ever-present hum of cameras and equipment, usually a subtle background noise at such events, seemed subdued, as though those operating them had been drawn into the same spellbinding stillness that gripped everyone else. All attention converged on the space between Ronda and the stage, where she stood anchored to the earth with a presence so steady it seemed to reshape the air itself. Trump's voice rang out again, louder this time, his tone forceful, pushing against the silence as if volume could reclaim what composure had already surrendered. His words pressed forward like waves striking a cliff, crashing hard and dissipating into nothing. He gestured sharply from the podium, his hands slicing through the air, demanding movement, demanding recognition. Yet the woman he had singled out did not flinch. Her gaze remained unwavering, her face calm, her stillness a quiet refusal that spoke in a language no order could translate or command. A low ripple moved through the crowd, subtle enough to barely disturb the hush. It was not sound so much as a shift of energy, the kind felt rather than heard. People began to lean forward slightly, drawn instinctively closer, their breaths slowing, their eyes fixed on her. The screens above magnified her figure. Ronda standing perfectly centered, framed by the memorial behind her and the immense openness of the sky overhead. Her silence expanded, filling every corner of the plaza, turning the wide public space into something intimate, almost private, as though every individual there felt suddenly connected by a shared thread of awareness they could not explain. Trump repeated himself, his words sharper now, threaded with an urgency that betrayed his frustration. He cited tradition, invoked symbols of authority, all under the pretense of ceremony. His voice reverberated from the speakers, but with every word, the disconnect grew clearer. What should have been an affirmation of control became instead a spotlight on the stark contrast before him. On one side, a man wielding sound like a weapon. On the other, a woman wielding silence like a shield. Ronda remained motionless, her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders square, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Her restraint was palpable, the kind of restraint that comes not from fear, but from absolute certainty. It was a stance that seemed to drain the noise from the air, reducing even the amplified force of his voice to little more than background. The longer she stood there without reacting, the more undeniable her gravity became. The crowd, restless moments ago, now seemed paralyzed, transfixed by the simple power of her refusal to yield. Somewhere in the second row, a veteran in full-dress uniform shifted forward slightly in his seat, his posture straightened instinctively, his chest rising as though in recognition of something deeply familiar. Beside him, a younger soldier, barely out of training, by the look of him, watched with wide eyes, his hands gripping his knees tightly. It was as if Ronda's stillness was pulling them upright too, summoning a quiet dignity in those who understood without needing to be told. On the far end of the plaza, a mother with a folded flag resting across her lap reached out and placed a hand over her heart. The motion was almost unconscious, a gesture born from the quiet emotion swelling in the space. Others noticed. Slowly, as though afraid to break the spell, heads began to turn away from the stage and toward her. Conversation stopped entirely. Phones lowered. Journalists, cameras still rolling, forgot for a moment to narrate, their microphones dipping uselessly as they stared. Trump's gestures grew broader, his face taut with a smile too large, a performance for cameras now lingering too long on someone else. He gestured toward her again, his hand raised high in expectation of submission, But his voice no longer filled the plaza the way it had minutes ago. His words, for all their insistence, seemed to skim across the surface of a scene already transformed into something he could not direct. And then it happened. The point at which silence became a presence unto itself. Rhonda slowly raised her head just slightly higher and let her gaze drift, not to him, but to the memorial wall standing behind the stage. Thousands of names were etched into that black stone, each one representing a life, a story cut short. Her focus lingered there as though drawing strength from it, as though anchoring herself not in the noise of the moment, but in the permanence of that silent witness. She did not speak, yet it was clear to everyone watching that her attention had shifted away from the podium entirely. The screens captured the image perfectly. Her profile against the stark reflection of the wall, a living figure mirrored against the names of the fallen. It was a frame so evocative that even the press corps fell quiet, their instincts overridden by something rawer than headline chasing. This was not spectacle anymore. It was something solemn, something that reoriented the entire gathering toward the purpose they had come for, but nearly forgotten beneath the weight of rhetoric and command. In the crowd, one by one, people began to mirror her posture. A man near the center straightened his spine. A woman behind him folded her hands and looked toward the memorial. A group of teenagers lowered their phones and stared quietly, as if suddenly aware they were standing on ground not meant for noise. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, an entire sea of faces began to follow her gaze, turning toward the wall rather than the stage. Trump noticed. His voice faltered briefly, caught between syllables, before he forced himself louder, sharper, but it no longer mattered. He spoke over a crowd that was no longer listening, a crowd that had silently shifted its center away from him entirely. His words became untethered from their intended audience, reverberating uselessly in a plaza now absorbed by the still figure of the woman below him and the memorial towering quietly behind. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Seconds felt doubled, as though time itself slowed to accommodate the weight pressing into the air. The wind had stilled entirely now, flags hanging limp in the heat, as if even nature dared not intrude. It was in this quiet that something undeniable crystallized. The recognition that authority wielded by noise could never eclipse the authority born of silence. Rhonda remained rooted, unshaken, her breath steady, her presence towering though she stood without rank or title, without microphone or platform. It was as if she alone carried the memory of what the day was meant to honor, and by merely holding that weight visibly, she commanded more than any order could compel. Behind her, the audience had grown motionless, as though caught between reverence and awe. A small girl sitting on her father's shoulders mimicked what she saw, straightening her tiny back and lifting her chin the same way. Nearby, a veteran with trembling hands removed his cap and pressed it to his chest, his lips moving silently in a gesture of respect. The plaza had shifted irrevocably. What began as a confrontation between two figures had transformed into a quiet reclamation of purpose. No one applauded, no one cheered, yet the silence spoke louder than any sound could have. It was heavy, absolute, and unassailable, a collective recognition that they were witnessing not an exchange of words or gestures, but a recentering of the day itself. Trump's hands tightened against the edges of the podium, his smile now strained, his voice carrying on out of habit more than effect. But the cameras had already abandoned his frame, focusing instead on her and the vast crowd behind her, all stilled in that profound hush. His role had diminished not through argument or defiance, but through a void he could not fill. In that stillness, the turning point became clear. It was no longer about his demand or her refusal. It was about what she had drawn forth without speaking, a silent unity that redefined the space, anchored not in power but in dignity. It was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who stood there, heads bowed or backs straightened, hands folded or pressed to their hearts. The plaza felt transformed, as though the stone beneath their feet carried something more than its physical weight. Even the press, tethered to their duty to document, seemed reluctant to break the moment with words. It was no longer just a memorial ceremony. It was an unspoken act of collective remembrance, commanded not from a stage, but from the silent figure standing below it. And there, at the heart of it all, Ronda did not move. She did not need to. Her silence had already done what no speech could achieve. The shift was complete. The moment was no longer his. It was hers, and through her, it belonged to everyone. For a long, suspended moment, the plaza was defined entirely by its silence. The demand still hung in the air like smoke, but its weight had been overtaken by something else, something deeper and far less tangible. Ronda stood rooted to her spot, unflinching in her quiet defiance, while the world around her seemed to hold its breath. The vast screens above her captured her stillness in crystalline detail, her posture straight and unwavering, her gaze steady on the memorial wall behind the stage, rather than the man at its center. It was a deliberate choice, though unspoken, a turning away from noise, from command, from spectacle itself. Then, without haste, she moved. It was not a grand motion, not the kind that filled a frame or demanded applause. It was slow, deliberate, and exacting, every inch purposeful. She raised her right hand, not sharply, not in the precise lines of military protocol, but gently, her palms settling against her chest, fingers splayed over the steady rhythm of her heart. Her head remained high, her chin lifted slightly as her eyes held on the names carved into the stone beyond the stage. She did not so much as glance upward toward Trump. It was a gesture for none of the living, and in that single choice, its meaning became unmistakable. The effect was immediate and electric. A collective exhale swept through the plaza, audible in the quiet like the soft rush of wind through trees. The crowd shifted, but not toward noise or applause. Instead, they followed her. In the front rows, a veteran with a rigid spine and silver hair removed his cap with trembling fingers and pressed it to his chest, mirroring her stance. Another followed, then another. Behind them, a ripple of movement spread outward through the thousands gathered. Men and women, young and old, soldiers in uniform, civilians in plain clothes, even children who barely understood what they imitated. All began to raise their hands or bow their heads in unison, their attention no longer on the stage but on her and the silent wall of names behind her. The cameras captured the transformation in sweeping arcs. What had been a divided mass moments ago now shifted as though moved by an invisible tide. Phones lowered, microphones dropped slightly out of frame. Even the press stood with unexpected solemnity, some holding their equipment in one hand, while their others settled over their hearts almost instinctively. No instruction was given. No words were spoken. It was the kind of unity that cannot be commanded because it is born from something wordless and undeniable. Up on the stage, Trump faltered mid-sentence. His voice, still raised, collided with a crowd that no longer seemed to hear him. He paused, glancing around, his eyes scanning faces that were no longer fixed on him. His gestures hung unfinished, his hand dropping slowly to the podium as he looked out over the expanse of people. All now turned toward the silent figure below. He cleared his throat, tried to speak again, but his words seemed to slip uselessly into the air. Ronda did not acknowledge him. Her silence grew heavier with every second, an unyielding presence that dwarfed even the booming amplifiers above. She stood perfectly still, her palm pressed against her heart, and faced the wall as if the thousands of people behind her did not exist. Yet they did, and they followed. The memorial loomed tall and black against the brightness of the day, its reflective surface glimmering in the sunlight. The names engraved there seemed to catch fire in the glow, a shimmering testament to lives lost and sacrifices unspoken. As the crowd mirrored her stance, that wall became the true center of the ceremony. It was no longer about speeches or podiums or hierarchy. It was about memory, about reverence pulled from a place far deeper than performance. Even the soldiers stationed at ceremonial positions on the edges of the plaza shifted. They were not given orders, but they moved all the same, their boots scraping softly against stone as they snapped to attention. Their hands rose in crisp salutes, not to the stage, but to the same focal point that held everyone else, the memorial and the lone figure who had turned them all toward it. Somewhere near the back, a small child looked up at her father, confusion flickering across his face as he tugged at his sleeve. The father did not answer. He simply placed his own hand over his chest and nodded toward the front, silently encouraging his son to do the same. The boy mimicked him, and soon even the youngest in the crowd stood quietly, their tiny hands pressed awkwardly against their hearts. The stillness was absolute now. No one dared speak. Even the birds seemed absent. Their calls vanished from the sky. The flags, hanging at full height, rippled lightly in a stray gust of wind, the sound faint and ceremonial, like a whisper threading through the silence. The cameras panned slowly across the expanse, capturing thousands of people standing together, motionless, heads bowed or eyes fixed forward, all bound to the same silent gesture. The networks broadcasted it live across the nation, and living rooms, offices, and crowded public screens everywhere became witnesses to a scene no script could have designed. A crowd turning away from power and toward dignity, led by nothing more than the presence of a single woman standing against the stage without uttering a word. Trump's smile had faded entirely now. His hands gripped the podium as he looked over the sea of people, his voice lost in his throat. For a man who thrived on the certainty of attention, it was disorienting in a way he had not anticipated. The plaza was no longer his stage. It belonged to her, and by extension, to everyone who had followed her lead. Ronda remained unshaken. She didn't move or glance toward the man on the stage, or the cameras documenting every moment. Her focus stayed on the memorial, and in her silence there was something that transcended words, something that pulled at every observer, demanding nothing but their stillness and their respect. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't protest. It was memory embodied and unrelenting, and it anchored the day back to what it had been meant to honor. One by one, even those closest to the stage who had hesitated began to follow. A high-ranking officer on the dais removed his cap. A journalist lowered her microphone and rested her free hand against her chest. Rows of cadets stiffened into sharp lines, their faces solemn. What began as a solitary gesture had become an undeniable current, vast and immovable, sweeping through every corner of the plaza. In the midst of it all, Ronda stood unyielding, her figure solitary and yet somehow encompassing all of them. She did not speak because she didn't need to. The gesture said everything, that respect could not be demanded, that honor belonged not to titles or platforms, but to those remembered in silence. The plaza held that stillness longer than anyone could have predicted. The sun climbed higher overhead, its light glancing off the memorial wall and into the eyes of those who stared toward it. No one blinked. No one shifted. They simply stood, hearts pressed beneath their palms, bound to the kind of unity that required no words and brooked no interruption. When Trump finally stepped back from the podium, uncertain, glancing over his shoulder toward his aides, the movement went almost unnoticed. The cameras no longer tracked him. They stayed fixed on her. The world was watching, but it was not watching him. It was watching Ronda Rousey, her hand against her heart, standing unmoved beneath the weight of history, and in that silence, she had redefined the moment entirely. The plaza stood suspended in that deep, reverent silence, a living monument of its own. The crowd had become still and unified, each person bound together in the same quiet gesture. The air was heavy, not oppressive, but weighted with significance, as though time itself had slowed to honor what was unfolding. Ronda remained the focal point of it all, her palm resting firmly over her heart, her gaze locked on the memorial wall in the distance. Nothing about her had changed. She hadn't spoken a word or moved an inch, but her presence dominated the space more profoundly than any speech ever could. The giant screens captured her perfectly, projecting her image across the entire expanse of the National Mall and into living rooms around the world. People at home watching the broadcast felt the hush seep into their own spaces. Televisions blared no commentary, only the low hum of microphones struggling to capture the quiet. Commentators in studios hesitated to speak, their rehearsed lines faltering in the face of what they saw. A figure who commanded through silence, drawing every eye without demanding it. Trump lingered behind the podium, his hands gripping its edges tightly. The confidence that had colored his posture earlier seemed to erode, replaced by something far less certain. His attempts to reclaim the moment had dwindled into nothing. He looked out over the plaza, scanning rows upon rows of faces that no longer turned toward him. Instead, every gaze followed her line of sight, fixed on the black granite wall inscribed with thousands of names. Even those closest to the stage officials, aides, members of the press, stood in stillness, their eyes reflecting the same unspoken understanding that had overtaken the crowd. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint metallic rattle of flagpoles and the scent of cut grass warmed by the midday sun. High above, the flags fluttered slowly in the breeze, their fabric snapping softly against the silence. In the front row, a veteran with deeply lined features held his cap against his chest, his shoulders squared despite the visible tremor in his hands. Beside him, a young cadet barely out of high school mirrored his posture, lips pressed together in a tight line of focus. Across the plaza, strangers who had never met shared glances of recognition and solidarity. For a fleeting moment, there were no divisions, no distinctions, just the collective quiet of a crowd remembering what had brought them here in the first place. Ronda remained immovable. It wasn't defiance, not in the way most would frame it. It was resolve. Every line of her stance radiated a quiet discipline, honed through years of training and discipline, but now channeled towards something deeper. Her silence had become a kind of language all its own, one that demanded nothing but presence, and in return, reshaped the entire gathering into a single unified act of respect. Trump exhaled audibly, the sound picked up faintly by the podium microphones, and adjusted his stance. He looked again toward the cameras, but their focus had shifted. The live feeds no longer centered on him, no longer amplified his movements. Instead, they remained steady on her and the sea of people standing in complete stillness behind her. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. What could he say? Even his voice would sound hollow against the vast, unyielding quiet that stretched before him. Minutes passed this way, though they felt longer, time stretching as if reluctant to intrude. In that span, the plaza transformed entirely. What had started as a tense confrontation had resolved into something solemn, something larger than the individuals involved. The memorial wall, bathed in sunlight, stood as the silent witness at the center of it all. Its surface reflected fragments of the crowd faces blurred by distance, flags waving faintly, and there, at its heart, the solitary figure of Ronda, steadfast and unmoved. It was only then that she lowered her hand. Slowly, carefully, she let it fall from her chest, her fingers uncurling to her side in a gesture neither abrupt nor ceremonial. The movement rippled outward almost instantly. The veteran in the front row followed, lowering his cap back onto his lap. Others mirrored the motion, their arms falling, their heads lifting slightly. But even then, no one spoke, and no one moved more than that. The silence remained, not broken, but softened, lingering like the echo of a bell long after its strike. Ronda turned slightly, not toward the stage, or the man who still stood there, but toward the memorial itself. She took a single step closer, her boots sounding against the stone in a sharp, solitary note that carried strangely far in the hush. Another step followed, and another. Each movement was measured, as if she were pacing herself deliberately, drawing out each second so that every footfall seemed to press deeper into the memory of the day. When she reached the base of the memorial wall, she stopped. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished stone, fractured faintly by the names inscribed there, each letter etched into permanence. She lifted her hand again and pressed it against the cool granite. Her fingers splayed lightly over a random scattering of names, no specific one, but all of them at once. The gesture was simple, unadorned, and devastatingly powerful. A murmur softer than words passed through the crowd behind her. It wasn't speech, not exactly. It was more like the shared intake of breath when something private becomes communal. The press, still silent, captured it from every angle. Ronda's hand against the memorial, the expanse of engraved names glowing faintly under the noon sun, the motionless crowd stretching back like an unbroken field of stone themselves. In that moment, Trump stepped back from the podium. His aides hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but when he turned and descended from the stage, it was without announcement, without spectacle. There was no applause, no escort of music or fanfare. He walked down the steps in silence, unnoticed by most, his figure small against the enormity of the scene behind him. His departure felt less like an exit and more like the quiet retreat of someone who no longer belonged to the moment unfolding. The cameras did not follow him. Their lenses stayed locked on Ronda and the memorial wall, on the quiet unity of the crowd behind her, on the way even the smallest children now seemed to understand that what they were witnessing was sacred in its own way. It was a stillness that asked for nothing and gave everything in return, a reclaiming of the day's meaning, drawn not by command or title, but by a gesture so simple and profound it could not be denied. Ronda lowered her hand from the wall. She stepped back once, twice, her eyes still on the stone before her, then turned slowly to face the plaza. The crowd remained as they were, their silence now reverent rather than tense. For a moment she looked out across them, and though her expression never shifted, it was clear that she saw them all. Then without a word she began to walk back the way she had come. No one followed her. No one spoke. They simply watched, standing still as she passed through the front rows, her pace unhurried and steady. The path opened before her naturally, people stepping aside instinctively, not out of fear but respect. Behind her the plaza remained quiet, as though reluctant to break the spell she had cast. By the time she reached the edge of the gathering, the moment had become indelible. Cameras captured her from every angle, The image of her lone figure retreating from the center of the mall, framed by flags and sunlight, etched itself into memory as vividly as the names on the memorial itself. And still, even after she had gone, no one moved. The silence persisted, not empty but full, weighted with what had just occurred. People continued to stand, their eyes fixed on the memorial, their breaths slow and measured, their hands now at their sides but their posture unyielding. It was as if she had passed something on to them simply by standing there, a reminder that some things were too sacred for noise, too profound for speeches. Long after the cameras powered down and the broadcast ended, that stillness remained. Even as the sun drifted lower in the sky, the plaza held itself in quiet reverence, unwilling to release what it had been given. For those who had witnessed it, both there and from afar, it was not something they would ever forget. And though Rhonda never once looked back, never sought to claim what she had done, the day would belong to her now, woven into history not by force or command, but by the silent strength of a single gesture that had transformed a spectacle into something sacred once more. If you enjoy this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Watch more of our videos for powerful moments like this, and share this video with others to keep the conversation going.